Welcome to the deep dive. So today we're tackling a topic that really gets people talking.
Yeah.
You know, the science and history behind all these claims about sex differences in the brain, in behavior.
It's a big one and definitely stirs up, well, a lot of discussion, a lot of strongly held beliefs.
Right. And look, if you're listening, you probably like to get, well, a real grasp on complex subjects, right? Not just the headlines. So our plan today is to try and cut through some of the noise, pull out the key stuff from, honestly, a ton of research.
And hopefully give you some genuine aha moments along the way, because this is a field where, what people think science says often overshadows what it actually says.
Exactly. So our mission today is really to understand what the science truly shows, separating, the solid findings from the myths that just won't die.
And also considering how much society, culture kind of shapes these ideas too. It's not just biology in a vacuum.
Definitely not. Okay, so to get started, maybe the history. This isn't a new debate, is it?
Oh, not at all. People have been arguing about this for over 200 years. Seriously, it's crossed fields from genetics, anthropology, social sciences, even politics gets mixed in.
Wow, 2 centuries. And I bet some of the early ideas were pretty wild.
You bet. What's really interesting, though, is how some of those early notions, even after they're scientifically debunked, they just linger, they morph, but they stick around.
Like, give me an example.
Well, the old classic women are less intelligent because their brains weigh less.
Right. Heard that one. Easily disproven, obviously.
Totally. But the underlying idea, that bias of female intellectual inferiority, it just keeps popping up in new forms.
Or like the map reading thing, that men are just inherently better map readers.
Exactly. That's another one. It persists, but the actual science doesn't really back it up in any simple way.
Which kind of leads us into this idea of neurotrash, right? Those, flashy brain scan pictures you see everywhere. In self-help books, popular articles.
Yeah, the colorful blobs that look super scientific.
Right. But they often don't actually explain very much that's meaningful, do they? It's more like the illusion of understanding.
Precisely. It gives this feeling of seeing the brain in action, but without much real substance behind the claims being made. And the whole men are from Mars, women are from Venus idea.
Oh, yeah.
Perfect example of neurotrash in action. It takes tiny, sometimes questionable findings and just explodes them into these massive fundamental differences.
And reinforces really simplistic stereotypes, like this is just how men are, this is just how women are, based on a brain scan.
Exactly. It ignores all the complexity, all the overlap.
If we rewind even further, those first attempts to find biological proof, they were pretty shaky, scientifically speaking.
Oh, definitely. Craniology, phrenology, measuring skull size, feeling bumps on the head.
Seriously.
Bumps on the head.
Yeah, trying to link that to intelligence or personality. And it was absolutely used to try and prove women were inferior.
Right.
There's this guy, Lebon. He actually used a head-measuring gadget, a cephalometer, to decide who was capable enough for independence or education. That's incredible.
He even compared women's head sizes to gorillas. It shows how these seemingly objective measurements were just tools to justify existing social hierarchies.
So the science itself was flawed, but it was also being used to prop up inequality. That's a crucial insight, isn't it? To always question why someone is claiming a biological difference.
Absolutely. And what's fascinating is craniology eventually got discredited, partly because one researcher pointed out that some really eminent smart anatomists actually had surprisingly small heads.
Oh, undermine the whole premise.
Kind of. But the damage was done, These biased approaches were used to support discrimination for a long time.
And then the argument shifted slightly, didn't it? From outright inferiority to something different.
Yeah, in the 18th, 19th centuries, it moved more towards this idea of complementary attributes.
Which sounds nicer on the surface.
It does, but really it just served to lock people into roles. Women in the private, caring sphere, men in the public, rational world. Oh, we're not unequal, we're just different, suited for different things. Very. It makes inequality look natural, even desirable, because the strengths of one group supposedly balance the weaknesses of the other. It's a subtle way to maintain power structures.
Okay, so that's the historical baggage. Let's talk about the brain itself, studying it.
Yeah.
It's not exactly straightforward, is it?
Not at all. I mean, think about it. You're trying to measure this incredibly complex 3D organ tucked away inside a skull. It's inherently difficult.
And the early methods, like autopsies, they had limitations.
Major limitations. Looking at a dead brain tells you something about structure, maybe, but understanding how it functioned when the person was alive, that's a huge leap. Very different from seeing it work in real time.
Right. And even now, with fancy imaging tech, there's still disagreement, right? Like the corpus callosum.
Ah, yes, the bundle of fibers connecting the two brain hemispheres. For years, people claimed there were size differences between men and women.
But
But the findings were all over the place. It often depended on exactly how they measured it, like a straight line measurement, a curved one, across which specific points.
so the method matters a lot.
Hugely. It highlights just how tricky brain measurement is. The way you ask the question, the tools you use, even the specific group of people you study it can all nudge the results one way or another.
And the same goes for gray matter versus white matter.
Similar story, yeah. There were reports females having more gray matter, males more white matter. Sounds significant. But then when researchers carefully accounted for the fact that, on average, male brains are slightly larger overall, those differences often shrank dramatically or disappeared completely. It shows how crucial it is to control for factors like overall size.
Okay, so brain structure is complex to measure. What about hormones? That's always a big part of the conversation around sex differences.
It is. And look, early animal research definitely showed clear links between hormones like testosterone and estrogen and physical sex traits, and reproductive behaviors too. That led to this idea that hormones basically organize the brain early on, setting it on a permanently male or female track.
But you're saying that's
Yeah.
outdated.
What?
Too simple.
Very much so. It's a simplistic view that doesn't capture the dynamic reality, especially in humans.
How so? Can you give an example, maybe?
Okay, think about PMS, premenstrual syndrome.
Right. Often blamed squarely on hormones.
Exactly. But how women experience PMS, or if they experience it negatively at all, is massively influenced by expectations. What society tells them to expect, what they believe will happen. Even the name of the questionnaires researchers use matters. If you give someone a menstrual distress questionnaire, guess what? They focus on the negative stuff.
Okay.
But there was research using a menstrual joy questionnaire, and surprise, surprise, people reported more positive feelings about their cycle.
No way. So the framing completely changed the perception.
It highlights how powerful our mindset and even just the language we use can be. It's a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy potentially shaping our experience of biology.
That's fascinating. So our beliefs can actually change how we feel hormones working. What about studies trying to look more directly at hormone effects, like with CAH, congenital adrenal hyperplasia?
Right, so CAH is a condition where individuals are exposed to higher levels of androgens, hormones typically higher in males, before birth. Researchers have studied these individuals, particularly girls with CAH, to see if that prenatal hormone exposure affects later behavior, like, say, toy preferences.
And what do they find?
Some studies do report that girls with CAH tend to show more interest in toys traditionally seen as boy toys, trucks, building blocks, that sort of thing.
So evidence for hormones shaping behavior.
Potentially. But it's really complex. These individuals also grow up knowing they have a condition, they interact with doctors, their parents know. They exist within a social world full of gender expectations.
Right. It's hard to isolate the hormone effect completely.
Yeah.
How do researchers even try to untangle biology from the social environment? It seems incredibly difficult.
It is incredibly difficult, and that's why there's still ongoing debate about interpreting those findings. It's not a simple A causes B situation.
And we also need to be careful about applying animal studies directly to humans, yeah? We hear a lot about hormones in, like, songbirds or voles.
Absolutely critical point. Animal research is invaluable for understanding basic biological mechanisms, hormones, genes, brain circuits. But extrapolating findings about complex social behavior, mating patterns in prairie voles, aggression in rats directly to human social behavior, that's a very risky leap.
Because our behavior is shaped by so much more. Culture, learning, individual choice.
Precisely. We have this incredibly complex layer of culture and cognition. Even something seemingly basic like testosterone levels in men aren't fixed. They can actually change depending on the social context.
Like what?
Like studies showing testosterone can drop when men interact compassionately with a crying baby doll. It suggests hormones respond to situations, they don't just dictate behavior rigidly.
Wow. Okay, so hormones are part of the picture, but not the whole deterministic story.
Not by a long shot.
Which brings us back to stereotypes. They're just everywhere. We use them constantly, often without thinking.
We do. They're mental shortcuts, right? Ways to quickly categorize and make sense of the world. But the problem is they can be based on faulty, outdated, or just plain wrong information.
And they lead to those self-fulfilling prophecies you mentioned.
Exactly. If you're constantly told or you just absorb the idea from the culture that people like you aren't good at math or aren't leaders,
You might start to believe it, or just avoid those things.
your brain might literally steer you away. Or the anxiety it creates can interfere with your performance.
It's like expecting to fail makes you more likely to fail.
That's the core idea behind stereotype threat.
Right. Can you unpack that a bit? And stereotype lift.
Sure. So stereotype threat is when the awareness of a negative stereotype about your group, like women are bad at math, creates anxiety that actually harms your performance on a relevant task, like a math test. Experiments show this effect clearly.
Just reminding someone of this stereotype is enough.
Sometimes, yeah. Or even subtle cues in the environment. And stereotype lift is the flip side. If you remind people of a positive stereotype about their group or a negative one about an outgroup, their performance can sometimes improve.
So our beliefs, triggered by these stereotypes, literally change how well we do things.
They absolutely can. It's powerful stuff.
Yeah.
Think about parallel parking. If you internalize the stereotype that your group isn't good at it, you might get flustered and actually perform worse.
Okay, I can see that. And this isn't just about tests, right? It bleeds into our social lives, too.
Oh, completely. A lot of current thinking emphasizes our social brain. The idea is that a big part of human success comes from our ability to cooperate, to navigate complex social worlds.
Makes sense.
Our brains are constantly trying to figure out social rules, understand what others are thinking or feeling, that mind-reading ability, and crucially, identify who's us and who's them.
And gender is a huge category for that us and them sorting.
One of the primary ones, yeah. So from a really, really young age, kids are soaking up these often unspoken rules about what's considered appropriate or normal for boys and for girls.
Girls don't do that, boys don't cry.
Exactly. It starts incredibly early and shapes behavior profoundly.
Yeah.
You mentioned those kids in Ethiopia learning laptops without instruction, amazing innate learning ability.
Yeah.
But put those same kids in a heavily gendered environment, and they'll also learn very quickly what toys are supposed to be for them, what activities are right.
And you mentioned our brains even track our social standing, a sociometer.
Yeah, there seems to be a system involving brain areas like the anterior cingulate cortex, the ACC, and the insula. These areas seem to monitor how we're doing socially, our perceived status, our inclusion or exclusion.
And that affects our self-esteem.
It seems to. Feeling rejected, feeling lower status can activate these areas. Our brains are highly tuned to whether we feel like we belong and are valued.
And this links back to how we categorize us versus them
Yeah.
and how stereotypes feed into that.
Precisely. Our brains need to categorize. Stereotypes offer quick, though often inaccurate data for that sorting process. Who's in my group? Who isn't? And that categorization fuels all sorts of social biases and interactions.
Okay. So the big question then, are baby boys and baby girls fundamentally different from the start? Are the brains pre-programmed?
That's a core belief for many people, that behavioral differences must stem from innate, hardwired brain differences present in infants. But the evidence for that is actually not that strong.
Why not? What does the research show?
Well, first off, studying infant brains with imaging is really challenging. They're tiny, they move. It's technically difficult.
Okay. But what about basic sensory stuff? How they react to sounds, language?
So babies can definitely distinguish sounds, male versus female voices, different languages, emotional tones. Newborns pick up on that. But when researchers look for consistent sex differences in these very early responses, many studies just don't find them. There's not a clear boy response and girl response pattern right out of the gate for many of these things.
What about social things like eye contact? That seems fundamental.
It is fundamental. And newborns do prefer faces looking right at them. But again, studies looking at how eye contact develops often find that any subtle sex differences emerge later on, not right at birth.
So maybe it's learned or encouraged differently.
That's the hypothesis. Different social experiences, different kinds of play being encouraged could absolutely contribute to differences that appear down the line.
And those developmental charts, the milestones, boys do this by X months, girls by Y months.
You know, the most striking thing about infant development is the sheer variability between individuals. Kids hit milestones at different times.
Right.
While the general sequence is similar, trying to pin variations rigidly onto sex, based often on potentially biased observations, isn't very scientifically sound. There's just a huge range of normal.
Okay. What about cognitive skills? Like mental rotation, that ability to picture objects rotating in space, often cited as a male advantage.
Yeah, people have tried to test this in infants, often by seeing if babies look longer when a familiar object is shown rotated, suggesting they recognize it.
Yeah.
But the methods are tricky and the findings are, well, inconsistent. Some studies report tiny differences, some find none. It's certainly not a clear, robust difference present from birth.
And innate talent for math or science.
Yeah.
Any sign of that in babies based on sex?
The consensus from current research is pretty clear. There's no compelling evidence for built-in sex differences in infants' aptitude for math or science concepts. Studies looking at how babies understand objects, numbers, spatial relationships, despite lots of effort, haven't found that baby boys are inherently better equipped.
So summing up this part,
Mm.
while some differences might emerge later in things like reading facial expressions or understanding others' perspective,
Mm-hmm.
the idea of distinctly male and female brains right from birth, pre-programmed for different skills,
Mm-hmm.
not really supported by the early evidence.
That's a fair summary, yes. Later differences are more likely a complex interaction between maybe subtle biological predispositions and the powerful influence of growing up in a very gendered world.
And that gendered world, it's inescapable, isn't it? The stereotypes are just constant.
They really are. Studies comparing attitudes over decades show how stubbornly persistent gender stereotypes remain. There's even a documented backlash effect when traditional roles get challenged. People push back.
And kids pick up on this stuff so fast they become little gender detectives.
That's a great way to put it. They actively figure out the rules, categorize everything, toys, clothes, activities, jobs, as for boys or for girls. They learn it from media, from toys, from watching adults.
Even just seeing a picture that violates the rules, like a man wearing lipstick,
Right.
grabs their attention,
Yep.
right?
Yeah.
Because it doesn't fit the pattern they've learned.
Exactly. It shows they've already internalized these categories, usually by age 2 or 3.
And the whole pink and blue thing,
Uh-huh.
it seems more intense now than ever.
It does, doesn't it? The pinkification of girlhood, the rigid blue camo for boys, it's everywhere. Clothes, toys, even, STEM toys for girls often get a pink makeover.
Which raises that question again. Is this reflecting some deep biological preference, or is it a social code we've created?
And crucially, does that code end up limiting kids? Does it subtly steer them away from things they might otherwise enjoy or be good at?
Yeah, does pushing girls away from building kits and boys away from doll houses actually serve them well? What does the toy preference research say?
Well, studies do show some average differences emerge early. Boys often gravitate more towards vehicles, building things, girls towards dolls, domestic play sets.
Okay, so there are differences.
Yes, but interpreting them as purely biological is tricky. The social learning view emphasizes how caregivers, peers, media all reinforce these preferences. Good job building versus, aren't you a good little mommy?
Right, and didn't you mention monkey studies showing labeling matters?
Yes, that was fascinating. When researchers presented toys to rhesus monkeys but grouped them differently, not as boy toys, girl toys, but as, say, animal-like versus object-like, the sex differences in preference largely vanished.
Wow. So how we categorize the toys changed the outcome.
It suggests the labels and presentation matter perhaps more than we think.
What about the CAH girls and toy preference again? How does that fit?
As we said, some studies link the higher prenatal androgen exposure in CAH girls to more interest in boy-typical toys. It's often cited as strong evidence for hormonal influence. But again, the social context is complex. It's not definitive proof that hormones alone dictate toy choice, ignoring all the learning and environmental factors. It's likely an interaction.
And social keys can be really powerful too. Like, they can actually change behavior on the spot.
Absolutely. There are studies showing that if you prime girls with gender stereotypes, say, having them color a picture of a girl with a doll right before a building task,
Yeah.
they actually perform worse or slower on the building task compared to a neutral prime.
Just from coloring a picture.
Seems so. Similarly, telling kids a story about someone winning a block building contest, young girls often just assume the winner must have been a boy. It shows how deeply these stereotypes get embedded and how they can influence engagement and assumptions about ability.
Okay, this connects directly to the STEM gender gap, right?
Mhm.
Science, technology, engineering, math, fewer women. Why? Is it ability? Interest? Brains?
It's the big question. The underrepresentation is real, especially in certain fields like physics and engineering, but blaming it solely on innate ability differences, the evidence doesn't really support that.
Because science is a process, not just an innate talent.
Exactly. It's a way of thinking, testing knowledge. And
Uh-huh.
historically, let's face it, women were systematically excluded from formal science for centuries.
Right. What about that systemizing versus empathizing brain theory? Men are systemizers, women are empathizers, therefore men do STEM.
Baron Cohen's theory. It's influential, and there might be average population differences in those tendencies, but it risks oversimplifying things massively and reinforcing stereotypes. Plenty of women are strong systemizers, plenty of men are highly empathetic, and career choice involves way more than just those two dimensions. It ignores interest, opportunity, bias.
Even the language we use about invention can be gendered.
Yeah, there's that neat study on metaphors describing invention using seed metaphors implying nurturing. Growth tended to boost perceptions of female inventors' brilliance, but lower it for men.
And light bulb metaphors, sudden insight.
Did the opposite boosted perceptions for male inventors, lowered them for female inventors? It shows these subtle linguistic biases about how we think men and women achieve breakthroughs.
And these biases filter down to kids really early, affecting how they see themselves.
For sure. Research shows that by age 6 or 7, girls become less likely than boys to associate brilliance or being really, really smart with their own gender.
Wow, by 7.
Yeah. And that belief then predicts whether they'll be interested in games or activities described as being for really smart kids. They start opting out early based on these societal messages.
Okay, but then there's that weird gender equality paradox. Countries with more gender equality sometimes have bigger STEM gaps. How does that work?
It's counterintuitive, right? The leading hypothesis isn't about ability because girls' academic performance in math and science is often equal or better in those countries.
So what is it?
It might be about interests. The idea is, in more equal societies with fewer overt barriers, girls feel freer to choose paths based on their interests. And on average, they might show stronger interests in fields involving people or language.
Where they often excel even more, like reading comprehension.
Exactly. While boys, on average, might still show stronger interest in systems-oriented fields like engineering. So, paradoxically, more freedom of choice might lead to divergence based on interest patterns, not ability constraints. It's debated, but it challenges simple narratives.
So the idea you have to be born for science is maybe not the full picture. What about the image of a scientist? Still overwhelmingly male.
The Draw Scientist test confirms this decade after decade. Kids, even girls themselves, overwhelmingly draw men, usually in a lab coat, maybe with crazy hair.
The stereotype holds strong.
Incredibly strong. It shows how ingrained that image is.
What about the argument that maybe fewer women reach the very top tiers of science because of natural aptitude differences, like the greater male variability idea?
Yes, the variability hypothesis. It suggests that male traits, including cognitive abilities, might have a wider spread, more individuals at the extreme high and low ends.
So more male geniuses, but also more men struggling.
That's the idea. And while there might be some statistical truth to greater male variance on some measures, it's often misused to explain away gender gaps at the top, ignoring all the systemic barriers, biases, and life choices that filter women out along the way.
Like the arguments in that Google memo a few years back, attributing tech's gender gap to biological differences in preferences.
Exactly. That memo cited supposed biological differences in interests and abilities, leading to huge pushback from researchers who pointed out it ignored vast amounts of data on discrimination, stereotypes, and social factors. It oversimplified massively.
And parents' own beliefs about gender, they can shape kids' skills too.
Seems so. There's research linking parents' gender stereotypical attitudes to their children's spatial abilities, but intriguingly, the link works differently for boys and girls. It suggests parental expectations and interactions subtly mold development along gendered lines.
Okay, let's tackle that male spatial brain myth head on. Where did it come from?
Well, early studies on people with brain damage did link spatial processing to certain brain regions, like the parietal cortex. And there was this, frankly, neuromyth that men had a spatial advantage because their right hemisphere was less cluttered with language functions.
Which isn't accurate.
No. But the bigger point now is brain plasticity. We know the brain changes with experience. Remember Tetris? Studies show that training people, girls and boys, on Tetris actually changes their brain structure and function related to spatial tasks. It shows these skills aren't fixed. They can be learned, and the brain adapts.
And stereotype threat messes with spatial performance too.
Big time. Tell women a spatial task is something men usually do better on, and their performance often drops.
But if you frame it differently,
If you frame it as learnable, or if you give explanations for potential difficulty that don't involve gender stereotypes, performance can improve. It shows how much mindset and expectation matter, right down to brain activity patterns associated with math anxiety.
So that whole men are better map readers trope.
It really needs rethinking.
Yeah.
When you dig into the research, there's way more similarity than difference. And any small average differences that pop up seem heavily influenced by experience, the specific way you test it, self-confidence, and yes, stereotype threat. The idea of a fundamentally different male spatial brain just doesn't hold water.
Okay. Let's shift to self-esteem. Is there a consistent gender gap there?
Large studies across many countries do tend to find a global pattern. On average, women report lower self-esteem than men.
Consistently.
Pretty consistently, yeah. But the size of that difference varies quite a bit between cultures.
And didn't you say something surprising earlier? That personality differences, including self-esteem, are sometimes larger in more equal countries.
Yeah, that's another paradox similar to the STEM one. In more prosperous, more egalitarian societies, the gap in self-reported personality traits, including self-esteem, sometimes widens.
Why on earth would that be?
Well, interpretations vary. One idea is that maybe in societies with fewer rigid role constraints, perhaps underlying biological or dispositional differences have more room to be expressed freely, the natural divergence idea. But others argue it could still be social. Perhaps different comparison groups or more subtle forms of sexism persist, or different pressures exist even in equal societies. It's really not settled.
And there are concepts like gender-based rejection sensitivity, feeling more worried about being rejected because of your gender.
Exactly. Or academic self-silencing women holding back opinions in class. Research suggests women might, on average, be more attuned to potential social rejection based on gender.
And that connects to stereotype threat affecting performance differently depending on anonymity.
Yes, some studies find women's math performance under stereotype threat improves more if they believe their answers are anonymous, suggesting a heightened concern about how their individual ability will be judged or represent their group. Brain scans during these situations often show heightened activity in emotional regulation and self-monitoring networks.
So the social signals about gender really get under the skin, affecting confidence and behavior.
It seems so. Even how we praise kids matters differently. Praising girls for being smart, an inherent trait, can make them less resilient after failure compared to praising effort. It's like their brain has this sensitive inner limiter constantly monitoring gendered social feedback.
Okay, so bring it all together. Where is the research heading now? What's the current state of play in brain and behavior differences?
Well, there's definitely a much bigger emphasis now on the challenges of interpreting brain imaging, especially that crucial issue of correcting for overall brain size.
It makes a difference.
A huge difference. Many studies that initially reported significant sex differences in brain volumes or structures, when they're reanalyzed with proper size correction, those differences often shrink dramatically or vanish altogether. There have been high-profile corrections in the literature.
And the whole idea of brain plasticity is central now.
Absolutely central. We can't look at adult brains and assume any differences we see are innate or fixed from birth. Our brains are shaped throughout life by everything we do, learn, and experience. So when studying sex-gender differences, researchers increasingly realize they have to try and account for different life experiences: education, hobbies, societal roles, discrimination. You can't ignore the environment.
Even hormones aren't fixed determinants anymore.
Right. As we discussed, hormone levels themselves can respond to social context. So the old idea of hormones rigidly dictating behavior is really giving way to a much more interactive model.
And those big reviews, the meta-analyses, looking across tons of studies on psychological traits, what's the general finding?
The overwhelming conclusion from decades of meta-analyses is the gender similarities hypothesis. For most psychological variables, cognitive abilities, personality traits, social behaviors, the differences between average men and average women are small or very small.
So, more alike than different.
Far more alike than different. Many previously trumpeted differences, like a large male math advantage or female verbal superiority, have shrunk or disappeared in large-scale analyses. The overlap is massive.
What about the brain itself? Is there such a thing as a male brain and a female brain?
Daphne Dole's work on the mosaic brain has been groundbreaking here.
What did she find?
By analyzing thousands of brain scans, her team showed that individual brains are typically a unique mosaic of features, some features more common in males, some more common in females, and some common to both.
So, not fitting neatly into two boxes.
Not at all. Very few brains, something like less than 6%, were consistently male-typical or female-typical across all measured features. Most people are a mix. Your brain mosaic is likely unique.
which really pushes us to think beyond a simple binary.
Exactly. Concepts like the latent structure of gender or thinking of gender as dimensional rather than just two categories. They suggest our focus on a strict binary might be obscuring the true, complex spectrum of human variation.
Okay, so as we wrap up this deep dive, what are the main takeaways you want people listening to hold on to?
I think the biggest one is that the science reveals a much, much more complex and nuanced picture than the stereotypes we swim in every day. Biological sex is real, of course, but our brains are incredibly plastic, shaped constantly by experience and society. Many of the big brain and ability differences that were claimed for years turn out to be small, inconsistent, or heavily influenced by things like testing methods and stereotypes.
Yeah, it really underscores moving beyond the binary, doesn't it? Recognizing variability, the mosaic nature of individuals, rather than forcing everyone into two camps.
Absolutely. And maybe the final thought to leave you with is this. How can understanding this plasticity, this power of social influence, help us build a world that's genuinely more equitable? A world that judges people on their individual merits, not on preconceived notions about their group.
Something to reflect on how these findings might change our own perceptions, our own interactions, day to day.
Exactly. How do we use this knowledge to challenge stereotypes, both in society and maybe even in ourselves?